Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK, and this video is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. In today's game, we are showcasing Wilds of Eldraine commanders. This set is super fun and absolutely crazy with all the fairytale inspirations. Use the link in the description to order yours today. First up, we have Kyle playing Rowan, Scion of War. Kyle is going to use his life as a resource, draining himself out to cast really big X spells. Scott's playing Obyra, and he's going to clutter up his board with all sorts of fairies, draining his opponents out, and he'll fly over their defenses. Matt is playing Brenard. This is Food and Golem Tribal, or Fulham Tribal, I guess. He plans to make some thick swole Fulhams. Lastly is me playing Eriette of the Charmed Apple. Auras are going to buff up my creatures and I'm going to drain my opponents out. Get on to the game. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Kyle played an untapped Blood Crypt at the cost of 2 life in order to cast Dragon's Rage Channeler. After that, he'll pass a turn over to Scott. He'll draw, and then he'll play a Swamp as his land for turn before passing over to Matt. He draws and plays the Shire as his land for turn, which unfortunately enters tapped. He passes the turn over to me. I play a Plains, and with nothing else to do, I say go over to Kyle. He plays a Swamp as his land and casts Stormfist Crusader. So now, on his upkeep, we'll all draw additional cards and lose some life. He moves into combat with DRC at Scott, dropping him to 39. Scott's turn, he draws and plays an island as his land and passes back to Matt. He plays a Plains as his land for turn and casts Talisman of Progress. And so far he's the only one at the table with any ramp. I'm jealous. On my turn I play a Swamp and cast Transcendent Envoy. It reduces the cost of my auras, so it's kinda like ramp. Over to Kyle's turn. On his upkeep, Stormfist Crusader triggers, so we'll all draw a card and take 1 point of life. And thanks to that, he found a Soul Ring, and he plays that, which triggers his DRC, having him surveil 1, which he puts the card to the bin. He drops a Swamp as his land for turn before casting his commander, Rowan, Scion of War. Then he'll move into combat, swinging Channeler at Matt and his Stormfist at me. Before damage, Matt decides to cast Swords to Plowshares. He chooses to exile Dragon's Rage Channeler, so that goes away forever. Kyle gains a life, I lose 2 points of life, and on Kyle's end step, Scott flashes in his commander, Obyra, Dreaming Duelist. Obyra? I don't know. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. On Scott's turn, he plays a Swamp as his land. He casts a very fancy Dark Ritual from Secret Lair drop. Then he casts Irenicus's Vile Duplication. He'll target his commander, making a copy of it that's not legendary, so it sticks around. And when that entered the battlefield, he drained each of his opponents 1 life. Afterwards, he moves into combat and attacks Kyle with his commander, dropping him to 35. Then he'll pass a turn over to Matt, who plays another Plains, and then he casts Golden Guardian. Hey, that's a golem! He passes the turn over to me, and I draw and play another Swamp. This allows me to cast Phyrexian Arena. So I'll start drawing some cards on my upkeep at the cost of some life. I pass back to Kyle, and again, Stormfist Crusader triggers, so we all draw a card and all lose a point of life. And with Rowan out, Kyle's motivated to lose his own life to reduce the cost of his spells. He casts Night's Whisperer, again, losing 2 points of life and drawing 2 cards. So far, that's a total of 3 life lost this turn for Kyle. He'll activate his commander, Rowan, and therefore reduce the cost of his black and red spells by 3. So big score is cast by paying 1 red manas. He discards a card, therefore drawing 2 cards and generating 2 treasure tokens. Then using that, he'll cast Unexpected Windfall, using the 2 treasure tokens, getting 2 treasure tokens, and drawing 2 more cards as well, after discarding. Finally, he'll cast Electric Revelation for 1 red manas, discarding a card and drawing 2 cards. But hey, that one's got flashback. Kyle's doing a good job of churning through his deck to find his win conditions. He drops a Swamp as his land, and then casts Greed for 1 black mana. That might be a good way of reducing his life total on a future turn as well. He moves into combat, attacking Scott. Scott can't block it because it has Menace, so he takes 2, and Kyle passes. On Scott's turn, he plays another Swamp before moving into combat, attacking both Matt and Kyle with his commander and his not commander. On Matt's turn, he plays an untapped Bountiful Promenade, and with that and the help of his Talisman, he'll cast his commander, Brenard, Ginger Sculptor. So now he's got a 6/6 defender. What? He passes the turn over to me. On my upkeep, I get to draw, thanks to Phyrexian Arena, losing 1 life and playing a Plains. Then I cast Unquestioned Authority, targeting my Transcendent Envoy, giving it protection from creatures, and I get to draw a card. Plus, it was a reduced cost, so that's great. I cast Swiftfoot Boots as a follow-up play, and on my end step, Matt casts Path to Exile on Kyle's commander. In response, Kyle sacks a treasure for 1 black mana to cast Fatal Push, targeting Brenard. Volt is online thanks to that sacked treasure. In response, Scott casts Misleading Signpost, mostly because it's a mana rock for him. Then, once that resolves, he casts Fairy Mastermind as well. Once that resolves, it triggers his commander and not commander. Fatal Push will finally resolve, killing Brenard, and Path to Exile resolves, exiling Rowan and allowing Kyle to go fetch up a basic land, entering the battlefield tapped. In this case, it's a mountain. And then onto Kyle's turn proper, Stormfist Crusader triggers, so again, we all draw a card and lose a life. Scott's Fairy Mastermind will trigger after seeing Kyle draw more than one, so he'll get to draw a second card as well. As his land for turn, Kyle plays a City of Brass, which can also ping him for one, making his commander that much better. He recasts his commander, and with Rowan back out onto the battlefield, he moves into his attack step, once again going to combat towards Scott with his Stormfist Crusader, dealing him 2 points of damage. On Scott's turn, he plays a command tower as his land for turn, before casting Glen Elendra Archmage. This thing's great! Counter spells on a stick. When that ETBs, he gets 2 triggers, therefore draining each of his opponents 2 points of life. Following that, he moves into combat, swinging at Kyle as well as Matt. Neither of them can do anything about it, so Scott keeps chipping away at their life totals. On Matt's turn, he plays a Breeding Pool, having it enter untapped at the cost of 2 points of life. Then he casts Elemental Bond, hoping to draw some cards in the near future. With that, he'll cast Tempered Steel, buffing all of his artifact creatures +2/+2. Scott does not like the sound of that, so he sacrifices Glen Elendra. Thanks to Persist, it re-enters the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it, again triggering his commander and fake commander, draining us each 2, and Tempered Steel was successfully countered as well. Then, onto my turn, I draw an additional card thanks to Phyrexian Arena. This also triggers Fairy Mastermind, again getting Scott an additional card draw as well. I play a Swamp as my land before casting Eriette of the Charmed Apple. I really don't like Glen Elendra on Scott's board, so I cast Parasitic Impetus on it. I thought maybe he'll counter it with its ability, but he doesn't. But in response, Kyle casts Bedevil on Glen Elendra, for his own reasons. One of those reasons being that he doesn't want me to be able to drain people out and gain life. So that makes me sad. On my end step, Eriette triggers and I drain everybody 1 and I gain 1. On Kyle's turn, again we all draw a card and lose a life, thanks to his Stormfist Crusader. Scott's Fairy Mastermind triggers, drawing him an additional card as well. Kyle casts Blood Celebrant. So this will make short work of Kyle's life total, as it were. He pays 1 black mana and paying a life to generate a black mana, which he can then use to pay Blood Celebrant again. He does this 10 times. So he goes to 7, and then he loses a life because of City of Brass. He activates his commander, Rowan, for casting Exsanguinate, where X equals 15. Can you believe it? So that will have each of his opponents lose 15 life. Therefore, Kyle gains 45 total life afterwards. It's not often that you see such a big reward for taking your own life total down to 7. Well, following that dramatic turn of events, he goes into the red zone, swinging his Crusader at Scott once again, dropping him to 14. His second main phase, he casts Sign in Blood, losing 2 more life and drawing 2 more cards. On Kyle's end step, Scott casts Pepper Smoke, shrink Blood Celebrant to death, and he gets to draw a card. Then onto Scott's turn proper, he'll draw, and then he'll play a Swamp as his land for turn, before casting Spark Double. And you guessed it, he's going to copy his commander once again. His third commander enters the battlefield, drain each opponent 2 more points of life, dropping Matt down to a precarious 1. He casts Feywild Visitor if one of his fairies deals combat damage to a player, which he's doing right now to Kyle, dropping him to 45. Trigger Feywild Visitor and make a 1/1 fairy dragon with flying. That'll trigger all 3 of his Obyras, and that knocks Matt out of the game, drops me down to 6 and Kyle to 42. He passes the turn, and on my upkeep, I draw a card thanks to Phyrexian Arena, losing a life. Scott draws another card as well. I move right into combat, swinging Eriette at Kyle. Then I cast Winds of Wrath, because I can't really deal with these board states anymore, and I'm holding on for dear life. So I wipe the board. I then play my land for turn, which is a Bojuka Bog, exiling Kyle's graveyard, and getting rid of anything with flashback that he had in there. On to Kyle's turn, he draws and plays a mountain as his land, loses a life because of City of Brass, and then casts Villas, Broker of Blood. This guy's great! He could shrink stuff, draw him cards, and make him lose life. He wants to do all of those things. He passes the turn over to Scott, who plays Midnight Clock, a mana rock that could potentially draw him a whole bunch of cards. With that out, he passes the turn over to me. I draw off of Phyrexian Arena, play Shine Shadow Snarl as my land for turn, before casting my commander once again, Eriette of the Charmed Apple. With her out onto the battlefield, I cast Ethereal Armor on my Transcendent Envoy, giving it +1/+1 for all of my enchantments and First Strike. Then I drain my opponents on my end step, gaining 2 points of life and dropping them 2 each. Vilis has Kyle draw a couple cards, and then on my end step, he activates Vilis, shrinking my commander by 1. Doesn't kill her, but he does get to draw 2 cards once again. On Kyle's turn, he moves into combat at Scott with Vilis. Scott decides to cast Scion of Una, and forgets that it doesn't have Shroud. So, before blocks are declared, Kyle uses Vilis to shrink Scion of Una to death, drawing 2 cards in the process, and then getting through with 8 points of damage at Scott's life total, dropping him to 4. In his second main phase, Kyle casts Torment of Hailfire, where X equals 7. He used City of Brass to do so he drew another card. In response, Scott casts Arcane Denial, which I appreciate very much. So, Torment of Hailfire gets countered, and on the next upkeep, Scott and Kyle get to draw some cards. On Scott's turn, he draws, and then draws for Arcane Denial. He casts Tigwell's Scouring. So, this will destroy all creatures, as well as make Scott 3 1/1 fairy rogues with flying. That was a fine way of dealing with Vilis, but I wish my creatures didn't die. On my turn, I play a Plains, and then cast Starfield Mystic. That'll reduce the cost of my enchantments, such as Smothering Tithe, which I cast next. And with that out, I cast Songbird's Blessing on my Starfield Mystic. So, I'm hoping to attack with it and get some auras out into the battlefield. On Kyle's turn, he draws and gets me a treasure off of Tithe, and then he casts Crackle with Power, where X equals 3. And I look over to Scott, the blue player on the board, and hope that he's got a counterspell. In response, he casts Orcish Bowmasters, which is not a counterspell, Scott.
And then we lose.
Where's the counterspell?
Bro, I've been countering everything.
You countered my
What
torment.
about you, Brandon?
I have 1 treasure. I could cast Mana Tithe. Quick, find me a Mana Tithe. Well, that'll knock Scott and myself out of the game, making Kyle the winner. Congratulations, bud. Kinda got out of hand quickly. Here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it, that's the game. So 2 of the 4 decks seem to do some work today. We're definitely going to be having rematch games featuring Wilds of Eldraine commanders, so stay tuned. Thank you again, Wizards of the Coast, for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check our description for links, and as always, thank you for watching.